Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's August 13th, and we have a lot to talk about. And one of the things that we'll be talking about a bit later in the podcast is the correlation between disability progression in MS and socioeconomic status. My guest today is Professor Helen Tremlett, who holds a Canada Research Chair in Neuroepidemiology and Multiple Sclerosis at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Professor Tremlett has been involved in more than 200 published research studies, and we're going to talk about a few of them today, including the research that she's done on disability progression in MS and its correlation to socioeconomic status. But before we get to my conversation with Professor Tremlett, there are a few other things that you should know about. In previous episodes of the podcast, we've talked about why it's important to begin disease-modifying therapy for MS. We've talked about research that strongly suggests that beginning disease-modifying therapy early helps delay MS progression, which is really another way of saying that it helps to prolong a higher quality of life. And to me, that seems to be a pretty solid reason. If you'd like one more good reason why people who've been diagnosed with MS should begin disease-modifying therapy sooner rather than later, you might want to consider a small research study done by a team in Japan. 49 people living with relapsing remitting MS were recruited for the study. Now, 16 of the study participants were treated with Gilenya. 23 of the participants were treated with Rebif, and 10 of the study participants received no disease-modifying therapy at all. Each study participant received an MRI scan at the beginning of the study and another MRI scan 1 year later. And the research team analyzed the number of MS relapses the study participants had experienced over the study's 1 year time frame, along with the changes in their brain volume. And they concluded that the number of MS relapses might be a predictor of later MS progression, and that early intervention by disease-modifying therapy could prevent or at least slow down brain atrophy in MS patients. And that's a big one, because once you lose brain volume, it won't come back. So pick a study, pick a reason. Just please be sure that if you or your family member are living with MS, make sure that disease-modifying therapy is at the top of your treatment plan. And if you'd like to review a summary of the study, I'll include a link in today's show notes. Another subject that we've been talking a lot about lately is the growing collection of research that makes the case that physical activity is beneficial for people living with MS. Now, for some people, that may seem like an obvious matter of fact. It may seem like a no-brainer. But for a long time, many people shared the opinion that since fatigue is already a prominent symptom of MS, people who were living with MS shouldn't take part in any activity that might further fatigue them or fatigue them more quickly. And because MS symptoms can be exacerbated when you overheat, that presented one more apparent reason why physical activity might not be great for people living with MS. But now there's a significant amount of research that illustrates that physical activity can actually improve your overall well-being if you're living with MS. So if you're anxious to up your game when it comes to physical activity, you might want to try a short walk. It doesn't have to be a hike through the wilderness or an all-day activity, but walking is good medicine. And if you're going to walk, you might want to listen to some music at the same time. Not only because music is, well, you don't need me to tell you that listening to music is a great experience in itself. But a research team from Belgium has just published the results of a small study that indicate that when people living with MS listen to music while they're walking, they gain additional benefits. The research team recruited 27 people with MS and 28 healthy controls, that is, people without MS. And they had all of the participants in the study walk for 12 minutes straight in total silence. Then they had them walk for 12 minutes straight, listening to the steady beat of a metronome. And finally, they walked 12 minutes straight, listening to music. And they found first that the 27 study participants who were living with MS could complete 12 minutes of uninterrupted walking. They also found that all of the participants in the study, both with or without MS, they all synchronized their walking with both the beat of the metronome and the beat of the music. But the people with MS synchronized better with music. And the study results showed that they didn't only walk in rhythm with the music. The results also showed that they perceived less cognitive fatigue. And they also experienced a higher sense of motivation when they walked for 12 minutes with music. So remember to take your tunes with you when you walk, because science has demonstrated that music really is good medicine. And if you'd like to review the details of the study, I'll include a link in today's show notes. Last week, we talked about the states that, over just the last month, had passed new laws providing greater financial support for family caregivers who have to take extended time away from work to care for a family member with a chronic illness, like progressive MS. Well, this week, the House of Representatives voted to give federal employees the same benefit. Now, the Family and Medical Leave Act is a law that's already on the books, and under the law, federal employees can take up to 12 weeks off within any 12-month period for the birth of a child, a new adoption, a new foster placement of a child in their home, or to care for a spouse, child, parent with a serious medical condition, or to care for themselves. But while the Family and Medical Leave Act allows for the time off, it's unpaid time off. And that can create a significant financial burden for a family that's already dealing with the financial ripple effects that often accompany living with a serious medical condition. So the House of Representatives passed a measure that changes this leave time from unpaid to paid, so that federal employees who have to take time off to care for a family member or themselves will receive their regular salaries during that leave. If the Senate chooses to support this measure, the law will become effective beginning October 1, 2020. But I should point out that the House has approved similar bills before, but they've never gotten out of the Senate. The good news is that as individual states continue to provide this same kind of support to family caregivers, congressional action becomes less and less meaningful. And while we're speaking about good news for family caregivers, here's a bit more. Now, AARP reports that of the 43.5 million family caregivers in America, 75% shave their loved one once every 3 to 5 days. And if you've ever tried doing that, you know it can be tricky. The caregiver is forced to hold the razor in an awkward position, and between angling and steadying the other person's head the right way, holding the razor and trying to manage shaving cream or shaving gel, well, you usually run out of hands pretty quickly. So the good news is that Gillette has developed a new razor that's specifically designed for caregivers who shave others. The razor is called the Trio. Now it's spelled Treo. And while Gillette estimates that 4,000 razors have been designed for people to shave themselves, the Trio is the first and so far only one that's been designed for people to shave someone else. The blade works with little to no water, but it still protects the skin from nicks and cuts. The handle of the razor is designed more like a paintbrush so that a caregiver doesn't have to keep their wrist steady at a weird or uncomfortable angle while they're trying to shave another person. And the shaving gel is actually built into the handle, so the other person's face stays lubricated while they're being shaved. Now, this may seem like a small thing, but shaving someone else is one of those tasks that a caregiver has to do over and over again. And over time, those little nuisances and inconveniences, they have a way of grinding on your psyche. So kudos to Gillette for rolling out a product that isn't going to make them a ton of money, but will make this one small thing easier for family caregivers and the loved ones they shave. A broad range of recent research makes the case that a connection exists between lifestyle factors like diet, smoking, and exercise, and MS progression. And the good news is that we can modify those lifestyle factors. We can choose to eat a healthy diet, we can choose to stop smoking, and we can add physical activity to our daily routine. But what about socioeconomic status? That isn't so easily changed. Someone can be born into a certain socioeconomic station in life, and living with a chronic illness like MS can make it even more challenging to change that. Well, now there's research that shows a correlation between socioeconomic status and MS disability progression. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Professor Helen Tremlett, who's been involved in more than 200 published research studies, and we're going to talk about a few of them, including this one. Earlier this year, we talked all about the new MS prevalence study that the National MS Society funded. I guess what we really talked about were the results of that study, because it showed that the prevalence of MS in the United States was actually nowhere near the 400,000 cases that had been previously estimated. It was actually more than double. Almost 1 million people are living with MS in the United States. And the research team that produced that study included some of the very best and brightest minds when it comes to MS research and research methodology. Well, my guest today is a member of that all-star research team and a co-author of that study, Dr. Helen Tremlett from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. In fact, Dr. Tremlett has been involved in more than 200 published research studies, and we're going to talk about a couple of them today. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Tremlett.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction, and I'm really excited to be here, and I do love listening to your podcast, so it's really going to be fun to actually be on it.
Well, a lot's already been said about the MS prevalence study that I mentioned a minute ago. We certainly looked at the study and the pretty brilliant methodology behind the study when the results were first published. So today, I thought we could talk about another really interesting study that you were involved in. It was a multinational study that looked at socioeconomic status and disability progression in MS. Even the title sounds pretty provocative. Can you tell me a little bit about that study?
Yeah, this was a great opportunity. So this involved 2 countries, so British Columbia in Canada and Wales in the UK. And that was very nice because we were able to show consistent findings across the 2 countries. And essentially we found that in people with a lower socioeconomic status, a lower socioeconomic status was associated with higher risk of disability progression in multiple sclerosis. Our socioeconomic status, in case you were wondering, is based on neighborhood level income. So everyone has a 3-digit postal code, which is like a zip code in the US, and you're able to get the neighborhood, the level of income of the neighborhood, and we link that together with disability scores in people with MS. Look at the relationship between the two. Now, what was really nice about this study is we could get socioeconomic status measures before MS symptom onset, because you're always concerned about reverse causation in these studies. We know that once people develop MS, unfortunately, their levels of income can drop, and therefore they can shift socioeconomic status. But we were getting here socioeconomic status before MS symptom onset, and looking how that influenced the future risk of disability progression. We also were able to get another measure in the Welsh population in the UK, and there we could get education level, and we found a similar relationship in that the lower the level of education, the higher the risk of disability progression. So it was really nice to get some consistency there across the two countries.
It's just a remarkable study with some real eye-opening kind of results that we're talking about. About how many people were you able to include in the study?
In total, it was around about 3,000 individuals. There are around 3,000 in total across the two sites.
I guess I'm wondering out loud if you were able to make any determinations whether there were specific reasons why that connection between socioeconomic status and progression of MS disability, why that connection might exist?
Yeah, that is now a really intriguing question, right? So we've got a lot of different ideas, and I think now we and others need to dig into this deeper for sure. I'd say first up, it's really hard to get these kind of measures related to socioeconomic status and those kind of aspects in a population with MS at the population level and have that link to future disability scores. So we were one of the first studies to actually ever do this, to look at socioeconomic status before MS symptom onset and disability outcomes in MS. And I would say now we've observed this relationship, now we need to dig down into it deeper. So I can't give you any specific reasons. I can tell you what we thought and what we discussed, because socioeconomic status can be a sort of a marker for many different things. So it can be obviously the neighborhood you live in and how wealthy that neighborhood is. It can influence, for instance, the walkability in that neighborhood, access to medical services. We also know that people in lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods, just in general, are at a greater risk of comorbidities or having many different conditions. They're more likely to smoke, have poorer diets, less access to healthy food, quote unquote. Perhaps even housing can be poorer, overcrowding, maybe risk of infection differs as well. And then, of course, education plays into that as well. And we observed that relationship between lower education and higher risk of disability progression in the Welsh population, which was really interesting. If walkability is challenging in your neighborhood, that may influence your physical activity and your levels of sunlight that you're getting exposed to. So you can see now many, many different things going on here. We were able to adjust our models or take into account comorbidities. And we were able, therefore, to look at things like lung conditions that kind of a proxy marker for smoking, but it's not the same as measuring smoking. So that you can tell there are many different factors that could play into that for sure. And I would love it if others went out and looked at these pieces in more detail, and we hope to look at some aspects ourselves in more detail as well.
It just sounds fascinating as you were describing some of the factors that you were able to observe and at least discuss a little bit. I was wondering actually whether taking a sociological approach to disease management is going to become part of a protocol at some point.
I think that would be wonderful. I mean, don't forget, we do this is epidemiology. We look at associations, and we do our best to avoid reverse causation. So we are inferring that there is this relationship between socioeconomic status, low socioeconomic status causing higher disability progression. But the proof is in the pudding. You do not know until you do an intervention, or, like to your point, develop a protocol and try it in a prospective study, whether you can really change outcomes in MS. And that is something I would love to do. If we get to that point where we have a specific intervention we think would be useful, to test to see if it really does benefit people with MS, that would be fabulous.
Some of the things that you mentioned as potential factors, like smoking, like access to healthy food, diet, and the ability to easily access any sort of physical activity in a particular neighborhood, so-called lifestyle factors. They seem to be popping up more and more as consistent elements in, if there even is such a thing, an MS profile. There, just in a very recent episode of the podcast, we looked at an Australian study that seemed to demonstrate a link between lifestyle factors and MS depression. And once again, I hear some of those same factors in our conversation today as being possibly linked to even disease progression. And to me, I just think it would be fascinating, as you say, to be able to discover whether better managing modifiable lifestyle factors can in itself improve quality of life, quite separate from the pharmacological interventions that someone may be able to undertake in managing their MS.
Yeah, no, I think they're all great areas to look at. And I know people have looked at trying to look at smoking cessation and how that influences or might benefit disability outcomes in MS and perhaps also health-related quality of life. I've been lucky enough to be involved with studies looking at comorbidities or other conditions people with MS may have and how they may be associated with future disability outcomes. And we have intriguing findings there as well. In particular, just to highlight one finding, that mental health or presence of depression, even early on in the disease, is associated with higher risk of disability progression later on. And yes, I've seen a lot of studies coming out looking at diet, and our team are also looking at the microbiome and how that might influence outcomes in MS. Now, these are getting into very specific areas.
I'm glad you mentioned the gut microbiome, because as we were talking about healthy food and diet, and there seems to have been already, we've seen a lot of science that suggests there is perhaps some sort of connection between the gut microbiome and MS. And I'm wondering if you could first define for us what the gut microbiome actually is, and then tell us about your research into the gut microbiome and its relationship to pediatric MS.
Oh, the gut microbiome is such an exciting area at the moment. So what is the microbiome? Well, all of us, we contain, we carry, we house trillions of microbes. They live in us and on us. The vast majority, 90% of them, live within our guts, particularly in the lower intestine and in the colon. And they do a lot of very cool and interesting and good things for us. Obviously help digest our foods. They can metabolize vitamins that we're not very good at producing, like vitamin K. They educate our immune system, and we are well aware the immune system is very much involved in MS. And they may also communicate indirectly with your brain. So they produce these metabolites, which then may go and affect how your brain functions. And you also have a direct connection between the gut and the brain. We've all felt that gut reaction to a situation where almost your gut tells your brain what's going on before your brain's figured out what's going on in a certain situation. So that gut reaction is that direct connection between your gut and your brain. I'm really been very lucky to be involved with this study looking at the gut microbiota in pediatric MS. So our question being is, how do all the microbes living in the guts of children with and without MS, how might they differ? And can that tell us anything about the disease processes in the people with pediatric MS? And can we therefore use that information to benefit people with MS and benefit children with multiple sclerosis? And can it tell us anything about what might cause MS? So the gut microbiome might be involved with somehow facilitating the onset of MS. And those are all areas we're exploring currently.
I'm curious if you were able to examine the makeup of the gut microbiome among children with MS who might already be on a disease-modifying therapy and compare them to children who were living with MS but had not yet started a DMT. Were you able to see any of that in your study?
Yes, so we got some pilot study findings that have been published in 2016 and 17, and they're cross-sectional, meaning that we're comparing kids with MS who were on a drug treatment for MS and kids who were not, so it's cross-sectional, and we do see a difference between those children. It's reasonably subtle, but there is a difference. Of course, we want to know then if and how being on a disease-modifying drug treatment alters the gut microbiome, and therefore what does that mean? So we are trying to look into those pieces right now in a larger study. Of course, pediatric MS, fortunately, is very rare. So it does require a huge multi-center study, which I'm lucky enough to be involved in both Canada and the US with the pediatric MS networks. And so we are currently right now sequencing samples. So I can't give you any results. Maybe I can come back in a year or so and tell you what we found. But yes, we do have some of the kids that are on a disease-modifying drug and some of them who are not. And we will be comparing those groups.
Well, that's fascinating, and I'm making a note right now that I'm going to be bugging you in a year or so that we can talk about this. I think I certainly agree with you that we can be grateful for the fact that pediatric MS is a rare situation for people to have to face, and at the same time, certainly one we can learn a lot from and hopefully find really effective treatments for. Well, you're obviously involved in that ongoing work. What else is on your plate going forward?
Oh, plenty. I guess areas that my team have been really interested in looking at, and we've now published a few studies, is looking at the prodrome in multiple sclerosis. So here we're defining a prodrome as, maybe I should say, fuzzy symptoms that occur before the classic onset of a disease, if that isn't too much of a long sentence. So really what we're asking is, or we're taking anecdotes from people with MS that they will say before their official MS symptom onset that they felt that there were things going on that weren't quite right. I hope that makes sense to the audience. So I find that if I walk into a room full of people with MS and I ask them if they can look back before MS symptom onset and did they notice anything strange going on, they will often come up with many different things that were going on in their life. They didn't quite feel right. People would say they tripped, they fell, many different things going on. They weren't sleeping well, and so on and so forth. So in short, we have found that in the 5 years leading up to MS symptom onset, people who are destined to develop MS and be diagnosed with MS are behaving differently relative to a matched general population control. And by behaving differently, what I mean is we can see that they're more likely to access the health system for things like mental health, so they're getting mental health diagnoses from their physician. They're 50% more likely to be referred and seen by a psychiatrist, and this is before they've even developed MS. We see irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, all these things are getting diagnosed, and these people are more likely to fill prescriptions for a whole bunch of different things. So what we're inferring or concluding from those studies, and we're trying to explore this further, is that before MS symptom onset, people have already developed MS. This is what we think it's telling us, and we think it's telling us that maybe there's opportunity here to identify MS earlier, and maybe then really affect change, because you can then perhaps, if there is an intervention that's going to be useful, you can perhaps intervene much, much earlier in the disease processes in MS, because these people already have MS before we've even called them MS. And also, just a second piece, if you want to know what causes multiple sclerosis, these studies are now telling us that you want to look before this 5-year window, because these people probably already have developed MS, and if you look at try and look at what causes MS, you need to look further back than 5 years. Otherwise, again, you'll be getting into this reverse causation challenge, where these people already have MS, they've already changed their behavior, and that's not what's triggering their MS. They already have MS. So if you want to know what causes MS, you need to go much further back in someone's history, which makes it all the more challenging. But I think these kind of studies, we want to look at them further in terms of the prodrome, are going to be really insightful to help us in the future.
Oh, complete sense and absolutely fascinating work. You know, one of my favorite things about doing this podcast is being able to introduce people who are affected by MS to the remarkable scientists who are committed to unraveling the MS riddle and improving our understanding of the disease. Well, Dr. Helen Tremlett, you are certainly a prominent member of that remarkable group of scientists. So thank you for all of your work in helping us better understand MS so that we can better treat it and eventually cure it. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you very much for getting the message out. I think it's really great to have this opportunity to talk about our research, and we do really like engaging people with MS. We have individuals with MS when we're writing our grant proposals and when we're talking about writing up our studies. So we really value that discussion and any feedback you guys have. So thanks for the opportunity.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. This past week, I heard from one of our listeners, Tony, who messaged me asking if it was possible to listen to Real Talk MS on his Amazon Echo. Well, I got Tony all squared away, and I'll share this reminder with you too. If you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. Then Alexa will always have the newest episode of Real Talk MS ready for you whenever you want to listen. And you can go back and listen to previous episodes. You can fast forward within an episode, and you can pause anywhere, come back another day, and Alexa will start the podcast right where you left off. Once you've enabled Real Talk MS, you just have to say, Alexa, play the Real Talk MS podcast. It is by far the easiest way to listen, and I hope you give it a try. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. And we'll catch you next time.